Now it's the 1st of September today, and so what we're starting to see at the moment is lots of inquiries of how do I prepare for the winter? What do I do? Are my bees ready? Um, of course, it really starts, the preparation for the winter really starts when we're doing our mite treatments and getting our bees nice and healthy. But what sort of obstacles, apart from the moisture issues that you were talking about, did you find for getting the bees through the winter?
Making sure that they have adequate food stores, I think is, probably, in my opinion, it's right up there with treating for mites, moisture issues. If they don't have enough food stores to get them through the winter,
Yeah.
they're going to be in trouble, and they could easily starve out. And
Yeah.
there's that, the beekeeper has to keep in mind, what do I take?
Yeah, I would take a little issue though with the mite treatments, with something being comparable with mite treatments. I would say that of all the things that you can do to have the bees ready for winter, the health of the bees, in other words, the mite levels in the hive and therefore virus levels in the hive, are by far and away number one.
Absolutely.
But of course, they'll starve to death without food.
But they have to be healthy to get the food.
That's right. They need to be healthy to get the food. But it's amazing how much it can vary. Let's say, for instance, a 2-story double brood chamber hive, which most of our viewers here would be probably going into the winter with, that might contain between 80 and 120 pounds of honey in that colony. Whereas these little girls here, I get them through the winter with probably only 30 pounds of honey in them, 35 pounds of honey in them, maybe 40 when they're absolutely full.
Yep.
And the hives that I overwintered 2 nukes over a double D using the double screen board, they actually came through the winter and they still had a frame and a half full of honey. So they probably only used 25 pounds of that 35 pounds of honey in there. So it's amazing how the colonies can cope with different amounts of food if they're set up right. And that's part of the key of this time of year, is getting those colonies set up right so that the cluster of bees is proportionate to the size of the hive and proportionate to the amount of honey in the hive.
Absolutely.
And so that's why I'm going through yards now, and some of the videos I'm going to be doing in the next week or so will be taking areas where I've got colonies which are not getting much of a honey flow, and I'll be taking any honey supers I've got off them and making sure they're starting to get fed now.
Right.
And because we've got the whole month to feed them, so we may as well use that month to get them full, get the bees adjusted to their hive size, because I'm taking those hives down to a single deep. So they're going from maybe double that size to half that size, and they're going to consolidate and make a nice compact cluster. Whereas the hives that are still having a great honey flow, they will be, I'll be keeping honey supers on for longer,
Right.
and then I'll take them off and then make sure that, because that brood chamber is kind of filling up with honey as the amount of brood is getting restricted by the bees themselves. And so there's less required to fill up those hives. And when we do take those honey supers off, you've got a hive that used to have enough bees to fill 4 boxes, now it's only filling 2 boxes.
Right.
And so they could do an awful lot more in those 2 boxes than they could spread over the whole 4 boxes.
A lot of people, like especially our newer beekeepers, they always ask, when do I start feeding them? Do I start feeding them now? Do I start feeding them after I take the honey super off? And even some people are of the mindset, we're coming into fall, I'm going to feed them right now before they take their honey supers off.
Yeah.
And by doing that, I don't think they realize that they're actually probably filling some of their honey supers with the sugar syrup that you're feeding them as well. So at what point do you decide when I'm going to start doing the sugar syrup and not worry about any honey supers or taking them off?
And that will vary very much from yard to yard or from hive to hive, depending on the circumstances. So if if I see that at the beginning of September I have lots of brood but very little food in my brood chamber, the parts that I'm going to overwinter, that is, so the brood chamber is the only part that I'm going to overwinter, if it's mostly brood and very little honey, honey supers are coming off beginning of September.
Yeah.
If unless I know there's a good honey flow on, because I've got the exception to that is where I'm running single deeps and all the honey is being stored above the queen excluder, of course. So in those, you have to treat them a bit differently. You have to stop when there's still time to fill up. But let's say an example of a 2 brood chamber hive, if the upper brood chamber is predominantly brood, it's probably best to start taking the honey supers off early in September so that you've got more time to feed them up. Because the honey flow is going to stop, whatever honey flow there is will usually stop come the first frost.
Right.
And that here, usually about the 25th of September or so. And that is one source of food coming into the hive. The other source of food is what we can feed them. And we'll feed them concentrated sugar syrup, 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. But really, we've only got until mid-October at the latest to feed them sugar syrup, because after that, it's now too cold for the bees to process that sugar syrup and concentrate it enough to make it a suitable food for the winter.
Right.
So we've got a limited window, maximum from now, of 6 weeks to have them ready for the winter time. And so if they've got a lot of brood and relatively little food stores, honey supers come off early. If they've got quite a bit of honey in there, let's say the upper brood chamber is everything bar 1 frame is honey and the 1 frame of brood in the middle, I'll keep my honey supers on right till the end of the honey flow, right till frost virtually, because I know I can then feed them with some sugar syrup for the last week or so, last couple of weeks, and they will fill up that last frame or 2. And if worse comes to worse, you can always swap a frame of honey from down below and swap it for a frame of brood up at the top. Because one of the key things I used to find, I lost the occasional colony assuming that if I had, say, 2 frames of brood up in the top at the end of September and the rest was full of honey, I thought, well, if I keep on feeding, they'll fill that up with sugar syrup come as soon as that brood emerges. But in fact, what they did was the sugar syrup they put down in the bottom of the brood chamber, leaving 2 frames upstairs with nothing in it, because the brood emerged and there was no honey in there. And so what happened then is that a cluster came up during the winter time. They had to go to one side of those empty combs or the other side of the empty combs to get to the honey. So they went up one side of the upper brood chamber, ate up all the honey, and come February or March, they starved to death because they literally couldn't go across those couple of empty combs to get to 30 pounds of honey on the other side of the brood box. And so positioning of the food is also important. So come the end of September, if you have any brood in your upper brood chamber, it's best to push that down into the lower brood chamber and take a frame of honey from the outside edge of the lower brood chamber and put it up in the top to replace that.
Absolutely.
Now, insulating hives, I found a big difference in my survivalship with overwintering. I used to preach, because I was taught by a master beekeeper, that here in Maine we can get away with just painting our hives a dark color. And in my earlier classes when I was teaching beekeeping, I used to say, well, I overwinter my hives with no insulation, because I used to be fed up with the insulation, and the dark color of the hive was an advantage to warming them up. Then I lost a whole boatload of hives one year because we had sort of unique weather situation. I don't know if you remember that, about 4 or 5 years ago.
Yes.
I lost a load of my hives because what happened is we got sudden cold. It was like a day in January, beginning of January, where we had nice 40-degree weather. The bees were out, cleansing flights. The clusters came apart, and the clusters were all over the hive, cleaning up the hive, doing great jobs. And then suddenly, when the sun set, the temperature dropped like a stone, and it went down to about 0 degrees Fahrenheit in the space of about an hour and a half. And it got cold so fast that the bees couldn't get back into a big cluster. They had to, because there was no insulation, the heat radiated out of the hives, and the clusters had to form little, like, tennis ball sized clusters all over the hive, none of which are big enough to keep warm, and they all died. leaving what little cluster they did get in the middle, like a softball-sized cluster, was just not enough bees to keep warm, say, over the sustained cold period a few days later. And I lost more than half my hives that one
Wow.
week just because of that.
Yep.
So since then I've been using the Bee Cozies and found very reliable overwintering with that, and not seeing those bees dying from little clusters. But those little tennis ball sized clusters all over the top of the hive, characteristic of them dying from sudden cold.
Now, do you find that using the bee cozies, seeing as how that maintains the temperature, they're not as prone, correct me if I'm wrong, they're not as prone to the temperature changes.
Yeah,
It helps to keep more
as
of a constant.
as a biologist, I just don't know why. You know, it nagged at me for a little while when I was teaching. I didn't put insulation on because, as a biologist, you know, stability is very important in terms of if an animal is trying to conserve its resources, its energy. If temperatures are going up and down, it's using up its resources much faster. With the Bee Cozy or any good insulation, now you're maintaining a stable, quiet environment inside that hive. And granted, you're not going to have as many cleansing flights, because when the sun shines on the hive, it takes a lot more to make the bees realize it's getting warm outside, and for them to go out on a cleansing flight. Whereas in an uninsulated hive, they're out on a cleansing flight relatively early because that heat penetrates the wall of the hive pretty well, and the cluster breaks apart. What you're actually interested in terms of survivorship is keeping that cluster together and not having bees go out on cleansing flights unless there's a proper break in the weather.
Right.
Because the bees are perfectly capable of overwintering for 4 or 5 months without flying.
Mm-hmm.
And here in Maine, we rarely get more than 2 months at a time where they can't fly.
Right.
And so it's not like up in central plain states where they could get 5 months of unrelenting weather.
Right.
Here, there is breaks in the weather. Might be 2 or 3 months apart, but it's enough that the bees can cope with.
Well, we've had some crazy winters, probably the last 2, where we've had warm snaps, and then we're right back to cold snaps and warm snaps and cold snaps, and I would think without that cozy, I think they would be more susceptible on that warm snap for them to go, hey, let's all go out, it's warming up, and then it, like you said, getting cold so quickly that when they come back in, they're not able to form that cluster as quick.
That's right, or they don't even have to leave the hive. All they have to be doing is going out onto the honey resources around the hive.
Right.
And suddenly they're trapped there because the temperature is suddenly down to 38, 37, 36, and now the bees are immobile. And it was a recipe for disaster. It didn't happen very frequently, but when it happened, you lost a whole load of hives. And so I paid with my Bee Cozies many times over by not having that happen.
I use them as well. I use them as well.
And what's more, if the temperature is stable and you don't have too big a draft on the hive and that sort of thing, they use a lot less honey. If they're not having, it's just like our oil bill in the winter time. If you've got bad insulation in your attic, you're going to burn a lot more oil to keep warm.
True.
It's exactly the same thing for the bees, or instead of burning oil, they're burning honey.
Yep.
And they get through a lot less honey if their temperature is relatively stable and they're not active. And so 2 things burn up honey. One is extreme cold, and the other is a warm winter. A warm winter, they're flying, they're burning up honey really fast. Mm-hmm. And so insulating the hive irons out those bumps in the road.
Right.
Now, I suppose my only issue with Bee Cozies is occasionally they get damaged by mice.
Yes.
And our hives have to be protected from mice with mouse guards, or sort of a reduced entrance and a screen on to stop mice getting in. But occasionally I'll find mice will have chewed a hole in my Bee Cozy. I would say that 1 in 10 of my cozies are not really usable the second year or the third year. So I'd say I'm replacing 1 in 10 of my Bee Cozies after each winter. But still, it's compared to, I mean, you can have a mouse chew a hole in the Bee Cozy and it's still perfectly good the next year, but when they've made a nest in there, or they've put a hole in the top as well as the bottom, and they get soaking wet inside, then it's best throwing them away and starting again.
Absolutely.
But a 10%, a 10-year lifespan for the cozy on average. That'll be, well, the average would be more like 5 or 6 years, but 10-year life turnover time for my cozies, I'm happy with that.
I'm a super fan of those as well. I mean, when I started with you, it was maybe throw a little tar paper around them, which some people do, and if that works for
And
them.
it's better than nothing.
Absolutely, it's
A lot better than nothing.
But what I find is that the cozies, I had a lot less issues with them not being able to read questions.
Yeah, and also it's inevitable that if you're trying to put your insulation on during November or something, the wind is if you're trying insulation boards and that sort of thing, they don't fit, or they're blowing down the field or something like that, and you're having to chase bits of polystyrene all over the place. And they're only as good as the good seal that you make on them as well. If the draft can get under them, they're not doing their job. So I found the cozies so much faster.
Yep, absolutely.
A little
Slide
bit
right
more
on over the
expensive
top.
to start with, but
Yep.
a lot better in the long run.
Absolutely.
And the results prove themselves as well. We get far better survivorship as what I found. These videos that we're doing, we're having in mind putting them on Facebook to really reach out to a very different audience from my normal YouTube channel, but also it might be something that you're interested in. Amy and I are thinking of putting together some specific content, particularly for beginners, content for people considering keeping bees, sort of like my YouTube channel is doing, but going into much more detail, being much more interactive, where people can come and ask questions specifically, perhaps download training videos,
Absolutely.
that
yeah.
sort of thing. We're kind of still brainstorming this as we go along. And so we very much welcome your input, whether that's on the YouTube channel or whether this is on Facebook or wherever you've seen this. Share it with your friends, let people know about it. But if you have particular requests for things that we can do more of, or things you think this is a great idea, you should do this, this, and this, we're really interested in hearing about it, because I think that it's definitely a gap. As Amy will testify, my phone is continuously going off with questions from people all over the place, asking advice. And to try and help with that, we want to try and make a friendly port of call for people to come to get specific information.
There's no stupid question, and there's no
Exactly.
question too simple or too complicated. So it's more of a place where you can come and ask any question, because that's what we want to do. We want to help.
Absolutely, we've all been beginners.
Absolutely.
And whether we started
Yep.
as 11-year-olds or 30-year-olds,
Yep.
the questions come in, and even now, I mean, I'm 62 now. God help me, but I'm still learning, and I've learned more in the last 3 years of beekeeping than I learned in the previous 40. So I had questions. I had a mentor to go to right up until 5 or 6 years ago when Harold Swan passed away. I haven't had a mentor since, but it's always so much more helpful to have somebody you can go to, or some form. I mean, mentors seem to be becoming a thing of the past, because it's harder to be in touch with people on a day-to-day basis, but it seems that social media is a way that we can reach out to people and talk to people about bees during the evenings and during the daytimes on rainy days and that sort of thing. You might not be able to go into the hives with them,
Right.
but you can go in. But who knows, maybe people can show us videos of their hive, and this is a problem I've got, can you help me?
And if one person, has a question, 100 other people may have the same question.
Oh, absolutely.
And we could, help them have specific content that they could go to find answers to those questions
Yeah.
that they have.
And just my classes and Amy's advice and things, these are, you learn by my mistakes rather than you making the mistakes. And we've made plenty of mistakes between us. But also you can learn from other people's mistakes. Like for instance, we were just talking about an acquaintance of ours who was putting Formic Pro in their hive, and didn't realize that you should not unwrap unwrap the paper from the Formic Pro. And Amy was able to stop the problem before it became an issue, because that would sort of overdose the hive on formic acid. So with an example like that, if you're applying Formic Pro or Microwave Quick Strips to your hive, they usually come in a foil wrap. You undo the foil wrap, and there's 2 pads in there, each wrapped in like a wax paper type of delivery system, and that is a slow release mechanism for the acid. So you don't take that paper off, you just put it straight on, and the bees are going to chew that paper off and take it out, but it's sort of calculated how long it should take for the acid to be released given the normal treatment. And so just very simple things like that, which doesn't necessarily occur to somebody to advise somebody against. These are the sort of things hopefully we can help people with.
Yes, definitely. So any questions? I mean, we're looking for feedback on any questions, common questions, mistakes maybe you made, mistakes that we've made. Nothing is too simple or too complicated. So
Yeah.
I think we're at this point we're looking for some feedback and seeing if we can come up with something that's
Yeah.
beneficial to everybody.
And maybe when we've got a bit more information together, we could do something like, what's it called, Facebook Live.
Yep.
The only
Live.
Facebook Live I've ever done was I accidentally phoned my kids. My phone was in my pocket, and
Yeah.
I could hear my phone going. I could hear voices saying, "Oh, Dad's butt dialed us," or something like that.
Yeah.
And Dad's doing a live broadcast from his pocket, and he doesn't know he's on Facebook Live. And somehow my phone had done Facebook Live, but fortunately only to my kids. They're used to what Dad gets up. Dad's lack of technical ability here, but hopefully, maybe in a couple of weeks,
Yeah.
we can work out how to do Facebook Live and do it without doing it from the inside of our pockets or something like
That'd be great.
that. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that. Well, hopefully you'll find that helpful. If you are, please put comments below, like it, subscribe, but also definitely please get messages to us of the sort of content you'd like to see on any sort of social media that we decide to push forward with. I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. See you next time.
And I'm Amy Nickerson, the Queen Bee. Take care.